Okay, good morning everybody. Good to be with you today. Today we're going to meet the very first Greek philosophers. What's a philosopher? Someone who does philosophy. Is that a good enough answer though? No, probably not. What did we say philosophy is? Miguel.
Love for wisdom or knowledge, you said?
Yes, love of wisdom is the literal definition of philosophy. We just take two Greek words. Philos is love, Sophia is wisdom. We smush them together, we got philosophia. In Spanish, Portuguese, most Romance languages, they just keep it. Philosophia. English, for some reason, when we talk about this, English, it just won't allow any words to sound pretty. So we take philosophia and we turn it into philosophy. Our class definition of philosophy has been this. So philosophy is a love of wisdom that inspires us to seek rational answers to big questions so that we might live and die well. That's how we define philosophy in this class. And we're going to talk about some of the first people to do philosophy in Greece. Before we do that though, I want to make it clear that the first people to do philosophy in Greece were not the first people to do philosophy. And sometimes you'll hear it said that way, that the Greeks were the first to philosophize. And when we meet the first one, his name's going to be Thales, and people say Thales was the first philosopher in the history of the world. Well, that's not true. He's very important, and the Greeks are very important, but they're not the first. Philosophy doesn't begin in Greece 2,800 years ago. It begins in Africa tens of thousands of years ago. Why? Because everything cultural begins in Africa. Africa is the common home of our species. For most of our species' time on Earth, every man, woman, and child was in Africa. The point where people started dispersing to other parts of the world is past the halfway point of our time on Earth. So how do we know that our African ancestors were doing philosophy? Well, what is philosophy? Seeking rational answers to big questions and trying to live and die well. We know that our ancestors in Africa were doing that because we know all the things that they created, all the things that are inventions of the people of Africa. We saw this list earlier in the Weirdos of the Universe lesson, but just take a look at some of these things. These things that are inventions of Africa. Language itself, storytelling, the use of tools and music, not just specific forms of music, but music itself is an African invention. And dancing and religion and marriage and education and all these other things on this list come to us from the people of Africa. You don't develop all these things without asking some pretty good or some pretty big questions. You don't develop all these things unless you're trying to find a rational way to live and die well. So we know that from earliest times the people of Africa were doing philosophy. What we don't know is the specifics of what their names were and what questions they were asking, because of all the important things that are on this list, there's one big one missing. What's missing from the list that would help us know what they were actually talking about? What's missing from this list? Agriculture? That's a great answer, because agriculture is one of the few things they didn't invent. It's not where we're going now, but that is a wonderful answer. Kylie. Writing. So basically they invented everything having to do with culture except for farming and writing. Farming and writing are both West Asian inventions, which means the details of the conversations they were having in Africa 100,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago are lost forever. But we know they were doing it. We know that others after them did it. The Greeks didn't exist in a vacuum. And though the Greeks are the first major European civilization, they're newcomers to the civilization game. There were civilizations that were already ancient when the Greeks were still digging in the dirt with sticks trying to catch worms. So you've got cultures like Egypt, and even before Egypt, Sumer. You've got the Assyrians, you've got the Babylonians. There were Middle Eastern and Near Eastern cultures that were already ancient to the Greeks. In fact, so here are, these aren't the actual pyramids, but here's a model of the pyramids of Giza that was made by my students Mariam Gergis and Maria Chaviri. I may be saying the name wrong. So our friend Aristotle, you can see his poster behind me, can't you? I don't want to drop this. So our friend Aristotle we'll talk more about in the next lesson. He's one of the most important ancient Greek philosophers. He was born closer to the day you were born than to the day these pyramids were built. And he's 2,400 years old. So there are cultures like Egypt that are far older than the Greeks, and therefore that influenced the Greeks. So when we meet these first Greek philosophers, they're doing really important stuff, but they're not the first to do any of it. Philosophy thrived in the small Middle Eastern nation of Israel, which would later influence the world primarily through its religious traditions. But in passing on Israelite religious traditions, along with the ancient literature that talks about their religious faith, there's a lot of their philosophy has come down to us too, much of it older than the Greeks. China and India have philosophical traditions at least as old as the Greeks. We talked a little bit, more than we usually get to. We get to spend criminally little time in Asia because we're trying to tell the whole history of the world in 9 months. And that just cannot be done. But at least we spent a little bit of time. We talked about Confucius and Mencius and compared the Chinese and Greek civilizations. So China and India have great philosophical traditions that don't depend on the Greeks. So why do we speak of the Greeks as if they're the first to do this? Part of it has to do with, this is kind of a virus. Not a biological virus, but a mental virus, a cultural virus. And maybe here we can, hopefully there's nobody against cultural vaccination, because we're going to try to get a little cultural vaccination against this virus. The virus is called Eurocentrism. Anyone know or even want to guess what Eurocentrism may be? Any thought? So what's showing on the map here? Europe's showing on the map, so we can guess that the euro is about Europe. Centrism, what's that sound like? Focused on Europe. Yes. So for the last 500 years, most of the last 500 years, here in the West, so in Western Europe, in the United States later on, history has been told as if Europe is the center of the world. As if European people are the people that matter. As if European culture is culture. And everybody else only matters if and when they overlap with European history. Now, what kind of people come from Europe? What do people from Europe look like? Look like me. What kind of person am I? Yeah, I confess. You know, I'm a white dude. All right. Europe is where the white people come from. And if you had been in school, it's like 75 or more years ago, not only would your history curriculum have been Eurocentric, it would have been overtly white supremacist. History used to be taught, Natalie. Yes, and not only because you're white. History used to be taught from the perspective that it was, I better just let the door open and close. I don't want just the last half of the sentence to yell out into the hall. As if, I hope nobody's waking up right now, as if white people were better. White people were the superior people and they were the people that mattered. We've thankfully made a lot of progress moving away from that in the last 7 or 8 decades, but there are lingering impacts of that still in our curriculum today. I don't think there's any bad guy behind the scenes plotting it like that, but that's how history has been told for centuries and centuries and centuries. So we need to vaccinate ourselves against that, especially in a class like this, where world history, but we're going to talk a lot about European history. This class is going to be kind of Eurocentric. Why? Because Europe's the best? White people are the best? No. But we are telling world history. There's only so many stories you can tell in 9 months. And we do want to tell the stories of what led throughout the history of the world to us being here in the United States of America in 2023. And that's largely a European story, but not exclusively so. And we're not focusing on Europe because Europe's the best. We're just focusing on Europe because that's the direct intellectual roots of our culture. There are other cultures, there are other social constellations. It's Tamim, I'm sorry. I keep calling it Tamim. I'm sorry. Tamim, I'm sorry. Told us yesterday. Okay, so after all this stuff about how the Greeks weren't the first, do I mean to say that the Greeks aren't important? No. Do I look like a guy who thinks the Greeks aren't important? The Greeks are huge. I've got Greek philosophers all over my walls. The Greeks are hugely important when it comes to philosophy. Because though they didn't invent it, they named it, and they made it a way of life. Right? They gave it the name love of wisdom. And they were the first to have people who lived, who devoted their lives solely to philosophy, solely to finding answers to these questions so that we might live and die well. It wasn't the birth of philosophy, but it was a renaissance, a rebirth that has forever changed the world. And we're going to talk about the first people to do that. We call them the pre-Socratic philosophers. These are the philosophers, just means that these are the philosophers that come before Socrates. And they didn't call themselves the pre-Socratic philosophers. Why not, Amanda Blanco? Yeah, they didn't know. Who do you come before? I don't know. It's before that they're not here yet. But we, which is going to be a hint about Socrates coming in the next lesson, he's going to have to be a really big deal. Because otherwise we don't divide time in different halves based on people who aren't big deals. So these are the pre-Socratic philosophers. Every philosopher has what we call a project. A philosopher's project is the subject or the thing that the philosopher has devoted his or her life to. It's what the philosopher is exploring. It's what the philosopher is studying. DALL-E AI image generation just made this for me this morning. All I had to do was type in, can you show me Plato and Aristotle working on a construction site? And it shot this out for me. We truly live in an age of magic. What sort of projects do philosophers explore? Well, there's a number of them. So if you're a metaphysicist, then you explore being, existence. Metaphysics is the study of existence itself. If you're an ethicist, you explore good and evil. I teach a college course on ethics right here with Southeastern University. You can take it anytime between grades 9 and 12. Not you, Amanda, I don't want you. But see, that wasn't very ethical of me, was it? You like that? Here's some ethics. There's some ethics on the floor for you. The study of good and evil is ethics. Aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that studies beauty and taste. Epistemology studies knowledge. What does it mean to know and what can we know? Political philosophy studies how we structure and govern our communities. Logic explores the process we use to reason in order to come into true information. And natural philosophy, what do you think besides the fact that I've got it right there on the screen, but even if I didn't, what would you think natural philosophy would look at? Nature, yes, Miguel wins. So natural philosophy is the branch of philosophy that looks at nature. Today we call that science. What today we call science used to be a branch of philosophy known as natural philosophy. And it turns out that most of the first couple generations of Greek philosophers were focused right here on the line pointing on my screen on this laptop. We're focused right here on natural philosophy. So these philosophers you're going to meet are people who are turning their attention toward nature. You'll recall we talked about Greek myth. We talked about the universal tendency. We've got all these mysteries. Why does the sky sometimes throw fire at me? And normally humans use storytelling to solve those mysteries, and that's where the myths come from. The natural philosophers, the pre-Socratics, these are going to be the ones who say, wait a minute, what if we tried to find natural explanations for natural phenomena? And that's the big impact they're going to have. Just asking that question, are there natural explanations? The questions they ask are going to be far more important than the actual answers they come up with. When you see what some of their first attempts to give explanations are going to be like, you'll think some of them are pretty silly. But the important thing is not their answers. It's the questions. Most of the first philosophers are united in trying to solve two problems, two mysteries. First problem is a problem of something called, I know we're throwing out big long words here, but it's all right, they'll make sense in a minute. First one is the problem of basic constituent substance. They want to know, what is everything made of? So you see the little girl here playing Play-Doh. Imagine the Play-Doh represents the universe. So this Play-Doh could become a horse, it could become a chair, it could be a spaceship, it could be any number of things. The philosophers want to know, what is the Play-Doh of the universe? At the most basic level, what is everything made of? Again, I think these are people who are living more than 2,000 years before anyone's ever looked through a microscope. So they don't know, they just don't have some of the facts, some of the data that we have. They're trying to figure out, we've got trees, we've got rocks, we've got water, we've got people, we've got rhinos, we've got the sun and the moon. What is it all made of? What's at the most basic level, what are the pieces that come together to become everything? Basic constituent substance. And the other is the mystery of change. You can watch and see, you put a block of ice on the ground, an ice cube on the ground, and what happens to it? It melts. It goes from solid to liquid, and it doesn't take that long, so that you can actually watch it happen. Most change is slower than that. You can't, I feel sometimes like you can watch me get old, but you really can't watch me get old. You can look at pictures of me as a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and eventually you're going to start noticing the differences. You can't watch me get old, but you know I'm getting old. And you know there's only two options: I keep on getting old, or just go ahead and up and die. And either one, it's this stuff changing. Everything seems to change. In fact, whatever this basic constituent substance is, this Play-Doh of the universe, it itself is changing over and over again. And that's how come some things are horses and some things are cars. There were no cars in ancient Greece, but they would say some things are horses and some things are trees and some things are rocks. How does that happen? Obviously, whatever the Play-Doh is something's making it change. If what makes Egberto fall out of his seat when nothing is pushing on him? So the mystery of basic constituent substance, what's the Play-Doh of the universe? And the problem of change is, what's the little girl of the universe? At this table, it's the little girl who can change the Play-Doh from a horse to a car to a chair. We don't seem to see some giant little girl around us, and yet something is changing us. From young men to old men to dead men. From desks to eventually piles of dust, and then the plastic legs, those will last forever, and someday, a whale's going to choke to death on them or something. and they end up in the ocean. What causes that change? What makes the Play-Doh become the horse, the car, the tree? That's what the pre-Socratic philosophers are looking for. Let's meet the first two or three of them today, and that'll be enough for today. So this is Thales. He lived from about 624 to 547 BC. He was in the town of Miletus. There were several philosophers from that town, so sometimes you'll hear them all referred together as the Miletus. Thales said that everything, we're just looking for the substance, the Play-Doh. Thales thinks the Play-Doh of everything is water. Everything's made out of water. Which is dumb, right? Is that dumb? I mean, if I said it, I'd be dumb. If I said it in 2023, having, 2 university degrees and all this stuff, I'd be dumb. He's not dumb. He's the first one to ask these questions ever, as far as we know. He's the first one to seek natural explanations, as far as we know. And so, what's he got to work with? No microscopes, no telescopes, no chemistry sets. He's got his eyes and ears. So he watches the world around him. He looks at the water, and he sees how, from nothing that he can see, frogs come out of the water. He looks at a piece of fruit, he bites into a piece of fruit, and what happens in his mouth? Juices come out. The water flows out of the fruit. If you take a bite out of it, and take a bite out of a person, bite hard enough, the water's going to come out of the people too. So he reasons that everything must, if you'll forgive the brilliant pun here, everything must boil down to water. Water for him is the Play-Doh, the basic constituent substance. But why is, how does some water turn into these paper towels, and some water turn into Isabel, and then some water turn into a mean old teacher hitting Isabel with the paper towels? What causes that change to happen? That's the other half of the mystery. What's the little girl? For him, he looks at it and he says, everything must be just full of, he uses the word gods here. Everything must be full of gods. Now, he's a Greek, an ancient Greek, and so he's part of a culture that worships the gods that Homer sings about. Zeus and Athena and Apollo and Poseidon, who are giant. He doesn't think that Zeus and Apollo and Athena and all the Greek gods are literally inside everything. He's using that word gods because he doesn't have another word. Essentially what he's saying is that there's a physical explanation, the water, the stuff, but then there must be something other than the physical world. Something powerful enough to operate on the physical stuff, the water, and to transform it, to drive this change. So everything's made of water for Thales. Everything is full of gods. Dolly, Image, crank this one out for me too, just today. This is Anaximander. This will be the last one we talk about today because he's also one of the most important. He is the most important, most influential person you've never heard of. He lived from about 610 to 545 BC. And I'll tell you what he said, then I'll tell you what he means. So first he says there's multiple worlds, and they come from and dissolve into what he calls the boundless. It's a little before his time here. You've heard of multiverse theory? What's multiverse theory, Miguel?
Just multiple universes.
Multiple universes, alternate universes, maybe an infinite number, maybe, or at any rate, a whole bunch of them. That's not just science fiction. You get it in science fiction. You get it in Marvel Comics. You get Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. But it's also today a very credible modern scientific theory. Hasn't been proved with evidence as far as I know. It may not even be provable by evidence, but the math seems to check out, according to the people who know better than I do how math works. He's living 2,600 years ago, and he said, yeah, there's a multiverse. All sorts of variations of the world. And they all come from and dissolve, or they all come out of and then dissolve back into a single source that he calls the boundless. We'll say more about that in a moment. He's also ahead of his time because he has a theory for how life began. So he envisions the earth full of just stuff, slime and sludge and dirt and stuff. And he thinks at some point the sun's rays got hot enough, and when they hit this slime at the place where the land transformed into, or land butted up against the water, it caused some sort of chemical reaction, and some of that slime came to life. It's not a very detailed version of evolution, but it's kind of what most biologists would say today is the most likely explanation for the beginning of life. But that's not the thing that makes him the most influential person you've never heard of. Not the multiple worlds and not the origin of life. It's this notion of the boundless. So, he says that the source of reality, where everything comes from, he says there is a single, infinite, what is a boundary? What's a boundary? If you're out of bounds in a football game, where have you gone?
Outside.
You've gone out. You're off the official field, right? You've gone beyond the limit. A boundary's a limit, right? If you build a wall around a city to keep the Mongols out or to keep space aliens out or whatever, that's a boundary, all right? Everything on the side of this wall is our city, and you can't come in. If something is boundless, it means it's without limits. It's another way of saying infinite. If something is finite, it has limits. The infinite is a complete absence of limits. The boundless for Anaximander is a single, infinite, eternal, and perfect source from which everything comes. Normally. I'm not asking anybody about what they think or what they believe, just of what you've heard. When you hear people start using language like this, one, infinite, eternal, perfect being, what are they talking about when you hear words like that? Say it loud for me. God, yes. So from Anaximander, not little g gods that marry their sisters and kill and rape and all that stuff, but God with a capital G. Anaximander, who you've never heard of. He's the first, though he doesn't use the word, he's the first to introduce Western culture to God with the capital G. If there has ever been a more influential philosophical idea than God, people live for God, people die for God, people kill for God, people heal for God, people base their whole life around the concept and have for centuries and centuries and centuries. We first hear it expressed in the West by Anaximander, one of our pre-Socratic philosophers. We'll meet some of the others next time. Any last questions, comments, anything? Okay. Aya, you want to take a selfie, show them who they've been working with? She does not. Thank you, Aya. Thanks for nothing, Amanda Blanco. That's all I need from you. Oh, Brandon, yes.
Oh, well, it's like irrelevant.
Well, that's my favorite kind of question. What's up?
Right.
Ooh, I am glad we captured this moment on film for all time. Yes. I don't want to put a boundary on your ability to use the bathroom. We're talking about Anaximander. All right. We'll go ahead and shut down the video. Thank you.